One of the consequences of the Giants handing out so many short-term deals is that they basically have a lot of work to do every offseason. So what is the Giants roster looking like next offseason going into the 2024 season? We'll take a thorough look next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, I was just thinking about, there's so much to say about this. The fact that the Giants hand out the shorter term deals and the opt-outs and all that, and there's a lot of complaints about that, and I understand why. But at the same time, there are benefits to it, and the kind of flexibility. I know it's like a hot word, and sometimes I think people kind of read it the wrong way. What it means to be flexible is simply that, a lot of times in baseball, you'll hand out a big contract and the player underperforms. And if you're, 5-6 year deal or whatever, it's guaranteed money and it's inflexible, right? You can't move on from it. But, there are downsides to the short-term deals that the Giants have handed out in recent years, but there are also upsides as well in that you're able to pivot if it doesn't go well. And if it does go well, it means you got a good year of performance out of the player. And so there's a lot of talk that these are kind of lose-lose scenarios. I'm talking about let's just look at last year, Carlos Rodon, for example. It was a 2-year, $44 million deal with an opt-out after the first year. And I think going into this year, looking at a guy like Michael Conforto, who gets a 2-year, $36 million deal with an opt-out after the first year, it's a very similar structure, including the fact that he can't opt out unless he reaches a plate appearance threshold. Rodon had the same thing. He couldn't opt out unless he surpassed 110 innings. And people call these lose-lose, but it's just kind of not correct in my opinion, because the win, if they opt out, it means they had a good enough season to opt out. And so you got a good season of a player without having to take on the risk of the long-term commitment that is guaranteed. Now, some will say it's a worthwhile risk to take. I think for certain players that's correct. And that's why they were willing to give 13 years, $350 million to Carlos Correa. They were willing at first until they found out about the ankle. And they were willing to give 9 years and $40 million a year to Aaron Judge. They were willing to give 12 years, $315 million to Bryce Harper. And so for superstar talent, they're willing to make that huge commitment. But for, a guy like Rodon, that was the only way you were getting him last year. And so was it better? I don't know. I mean, I guess you could say instead of doing that, you could have just signed a Kevin Gausman to 5 years. But they got even better production in 2022 without the long-term risk that comes along with the 5-year deal for the pitcher. And so, anyway, it's just not a lose-lose in my opinion. And I've made this case before as well. You say the downside is if they have a bad year, if they get hurt or whatever, then it's a lose because then they're going to opt in. Except I would disagree with that point as well, because they like the player enough that they would want them back for 1 year. And again, it would be a 1-year kind of prove it deal. And so I think they like when players have that motivation to have a big season so that they can hit the market on a high note. And so on these 2-year deals with the opt-out, you're getting that motivation in year 1. And if it doesn't go well and they have an injury or poor performance or whatever, they opt in and they had that same motivation in year 2 because it's, again, a contract year. So anyway, looking ahead, that's kind of my take on that. And the Giants have given out a lot of these, and people do complain about them. And I understand it from a growing attached to the player's perspective. But I've made the case before, and I'm going to make it again. The players who you're really going to grow attached to, they're going to continue to pursue those superstar players, I think, like they did with Correa and Judge and Harper. even when they were bad, they were pursuing Harper because he was such an elite talent and 26 years old. And then the homegrown players, those guys come with 6 years of team control. So like Logan Webb, he's been here a while and he's still got 3 more years of team control. Camilo Doval has been here a couple years. He still has 5 more years of team control. And so, and Kyle Harrison, when he shows up, 6 years of service. And so if he shows up in like May of this year or June or something, he'll have all of 2023 plus 6 additional years of team control. And so that's why homegrown players, if your big commitments are only going to be to superstars in free agency you're not guaranteed to get, and homegrown players, because it's year to year with these homegrown guys, because they're not on guaranteed contracts. They become, arbitration eligible, and you can non-tender them if their performance falls off. And so that's kind of the plan, and that's why the farm system is really important for the future of the Giants. But just looking ahead to kind of, okay, the 2023 season is over. Hopefully it was a good one for the Giants, but let's just imagine, what does it look like? Who are the slam dunk free agents? Well, there's Joc Pederson, who currently is back this year on the 1-year qualifying offer. And so this is another example of they get a player they like on 2 consecutive 1-year deals. And I think that they like that. They like the flexibility that it provides. And it's similar to the homegrown players. You have all that team control, but it's year to year without the guaranteed commitments that you're taking on a lot of risk. And I look back at the when Farhan Zaidi took over, there were all these commitments like to Johnny Cueto and Jeff Samardzija, and the veterans who were showing serious signs of decline like Posey, Belt, and Crawford and Longoria. It was just all these multiple year commitments at high prices relative to what their production was. And that's why the Giants were bad in 2017 and 2018, because they had this bloated payroll. They were paying a bunch of guys who were underperforming those contracts. And so because the team had a budget, and they were already spending a lot relative to what was kind of average in the league, they were top spenders and yet bad. And so that's kind of the scenario that teams really try to avoid. And so while there are downsides to what the Giants do now, they're in a flexible position each and every offseason right now where they're able to pivot to other guys if certain players don't work out. And so anyway, that's the case, Pederson entering another walk year. And then the other pure free agents, Brandon Crawford entering the last year of his deal, Alex Wood entering the last year of his deal, and then Jakob Junis, John Brebbia, and Scott Alexander. Those are your pure free agents. So coming up in just a minute, we're going to look at the rest of the state of the roster following up on the 2023 season, what things look like, what the Giants will have to do in the offseason next year. So we'll get into it in just a minute. But before we do, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app, which is safe, secure, and super easy to use, and then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. I'm currently looking. They've got so many amazing basketball odds. The Warriors not having their best season at plus 1,700 to win the NBA Finals. Those are implied odds of around 5% last time I looked. And I'm just comparing that, looking at like 538.com. What do they say are the Warriors championship odds? Latest I checked, they're kind of aligned, but if there's a difference there, then something like that is a fun opportunity to maybe put a little money down and have an opportunity at a big payout. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, here we go. We're going to look a little bit closer at what is the Giants roster going to look like after the 2023 season. I think I've made my point. I just think there's certainly downsides to every approach, really. Like if you're just a team like that is just throwing around huge contracts. The thing is, if you have no budgetary restrictions, which is just no team operates that way outside of apparently the Mets now. But every team, there's some number they're not willing to go past when it comes to spending on the roster. And so when you have a limit on your spending, you've got to be smart about how you get there. And so when I think of the Phillies and, for example, Nick Castellanos last year got a 5-year, $100 million contract. And immediately he just turned in a really poor season last year. He is a guy who historically has been a bad defender. So he continued to be a bad defender, and he just didn't hit. And now you're on the hook for 4 years, $80 million more, and it already looks like something they wish they didn't have. And it didn't stop them from going out and getting Trey Turner. I'm not saying the Giants, they should go out and get these superstar players, and they tried. I wish they could have a do-over, because if you knew that Correa's ankle was going to fall apart in the physical, they probably would have pursued somebody else, whether it was Trey Turner or even a Dansby Swanson type. But that's neither here nor there. It kind of was a disaster in that regard, but they did as good of a job as they could adding talent without getting superstar talent. They did get like 7 solid players, and projections have them competing for a playoff spot. And so we'll see how it goes. Obviously, a lot of pressure on winning, but what does that look like? So like I said, Pederson, Crawford, Wood, and Junis, Brebbia, and Alexander. So it's not the hugest kind of list of major guaranteed free agents. But then when we start to look at the opt-outs, you've got Michael Conforto, like I mentioned, who can opt out of 1 year, $18 million, assuming he must reach 350 plate appearances in order to have the right to opt out. And then Sean Manaea and Ross Stripling each will have the ability to opt out after the 2023 season. And then beyond that, there's just a $10 million club option for Alex Cobb that comes with just a $2 million buyout. So when we start to look at the numbers behind all of this, so the way we'll talk about it is guaranteed money. And so this guaranteed money means, all these player options / opt-outs are guaranteed, because if something goes wrong, that we consider player options guarantees because they can choose to opt in, and therefore you'd be on the hook for it. And so if all of them opt in for 2023, and because the Giants have a club option on Alex Cobb, the only guarantee on that club option is the $2 million buyout, not the whole thing. So if Cobb has a bad season, the Giants can, move on and only have to pay $2 million. But if everybody opts in and they buy out Cobb, it's $99 million committed, which is pretty low. I mean, the Giants' current projected payroll for 2023 is $192 million. So, it'd be about, and look, a lot of these guys are arbitration eligible, but those are not guarantees, as I mentioned earlier. But it would be $99 million committed, plus then add in all your arbitration eligible players who are not guaranteed, but you would want a lot of them back, like Logan Webb and Doval, for example, Tyro Estrada. And then, so I mentioned all the different opt-outs, but let's just imagine everybody opts out: Conforto, Manaea, and Stripling. That's $43 million. And so if everybody opts out, that guaranteed number moves down to just $56 million. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say flexibility. Quote unquote, worst case scenario, or at least I don't like to say it that way, but highest case scenario in terms of commitments is $99 million. And lowest case scenario is just $56 million, which means, basically $100+ million in 2024 spending to get back to where they were in 2023. And of course, I think, Cobb, if he has the type of season he's capable of, they'll pick that up. So if everybody opts out and they pick up Alex Cobb's club option, that would be just $64 million committed. And that would allow them to kind of remake their roster however they see fit. The problem is next year's free agent class isn't so great. And specifically, like, the position that stands out to me the most is the shortstop position. And that's probably why they went out and tried to sign Carlos Correa for 13 years, because Brandon Crawford is entering the last year of his deal, and he, is getting up there in age. I think he's 37 this year. He is going to turn 37 in January of next year. So anyway, he's 36 all of this year, but going into 2024, he's going to be an age 37 player. And so this year is pretty big for him just in terms of, if he has another down year like he had in 2022, he might have a hard time finding a job. But if he kind of lands somewhere between 2021 and 2022, then he could be a guy who could even get a multi-year deal starting at age 37. And it might be with the Giants. I should kind of walk that back. I don't think a multi-year deal is likely, but he's a guy who I would kind of put money, if I had to now, on him being back for at least one more year in 2024, because who do they have after Brandon Crawford? You look at kind of who do they have in the minors right now? And at the shortstop position, there's Will Wilson, who hasn't performed at the AAA level. There's Donovan Walton, who hasn't performed at the Major League level. Marco Luciano is obviously in the system and figures to start the year in AA, but is he going to be ready to just take over the shortstop position starting in 2024? I don't think that's likely. Could he debut in 2024 and kind of establish himself and then look like that guy for 2025? Maybe, but there's a lot of people who don't view him even as a shortstop. And so this shortstop position is unsettled. And so Brandon Crawford reaching free agency and not having landed Correa is kind of a problem. And you look at who is a free agent at the shortstop position, it's a whole lot of nothing, really. I mean, Ahmed Rosario, but he hasn't done well defensively. Isaiah Kiner-Falefa, Adalberto Mondesi, and Brandon Crawford, and Elvis Andrews, who just barely was able to get a contract for this season. Nick Ahmed, who's going to be 34. So it's just not a great shortstop class, coming off 2 consecutive years when there were great shortstop classes in free agency. And so, I want to say the Giants really should have done what they could to get one, and they did, but then a nightmare scenario unfolded after that. So beyond that, the starting pitching, they have a lot of guys who can opt out, but also you've got Webb, who going into 2024 will have 2 more years of team control. This is why we start talking about an extension for Webb, because he's getting closer to free agency, but still 3 years away. Alex Cobb, like I said, they can bring back on a 1-year deal if they want to going into 2024. And then beyond that, Anthony DeSclafani still has 1 year. And by the way, reports on DeSclafani are that his ankle is doing much better. He had an operation, and he didn't have a groove for his tendon, and so they created a groove for the tendon to stabilize it, and apparently it was successful, and he's a full go. And I just keep reminding people, he was such a good pitcher for them in 2021, and they're paying him like a back-end pitcher. He's not being paid to be an ace. And so, the season he had in 2021, if we're just ignoring that and focusing on his 5 games in 2022 when he was so hurt that he needed major ankle surgery, then I think it's recency bias. And so hopefully Kyle Harrison breaks through this year and looks like, going into 2024, a clear member of that rotation. So then you would have Harrison with all his club control, you would have Webb, and you would have Cobb, and you also already have DeSclafani under contract. And then, Manaea and Stripling each have the opt-out. So I wouldn't think it would be too crazy to think one of them doesn't opt out. Like if one of them doesn't have a great year, then one of them could be back. And then you're already basically looking at a full rotation. And so the Giants wouldn't have that much work to do on the starting rotation. And so once again, kind of like this offseason, they could focus their efforts on position players. And the real prizes of the position player mix are Shohei Ohtani, who's also a pitcher. And I guess, if you already got 5 starters, maybe Shohei Ohtani is your 6th. And also he's obviously a true impact bat. And then there's also Manny Machado. So coming up in just a minute, we're going to kind of scour the free agent class. Where do the Giants need to pick up some players next offseason, and who's out there at those various positions? So we'll get into it in just a minute. But before we do, all right, as promised, we are going to look at who are the free agents at these positions where the Giants are going to have openings. Joc Pederson is going to be, a pure free agent. And so here's the thing, too, is that I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made that the Giants, with these players, with the opt-outs, that they're just not going to bring them back. But I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it might be true when it comes to pitchers, because we now have 2 pretty clear examples of the Giants getting ace caliber production out of Kevin Gausman and Carlos Rodon. And in neither case, even though, especially with Gausman, who was like vocal about wanting to come back, and he said they never made him an offer. And so it's pretty darn clear they're just not interested in giving out deals longer than 3 years, it seems, for a starting pitcher. And so this is where I, again, will circle back and say homegrown pitchers are likely, I think they have a sweet spot with this like Ross Stripling, Alex Wood, Alex Cobb, where you're kind of like $20-30 million over 2-3 years. They're fine with that. And then with like the Carlos Rodon upside play, Kevin Gausman, when he first came to the Giants, it was a 1 year, $9 million deal. And then they offered him the qualifying offer and he came back on that. So it was like 2 1-year deals. But again, Logan Webb is going to end up being here for over 6 seasons. Kyle Harrison, assuming and hoping he can establish himself to be, similar in value to Webb or even better, would be here for at least 6 seasons, probably more, because it's service time, not years. And so so those are the guys to grow attached to on the pitching side. But we're looking at, a Michael Conforto. I just don't assume at all that they wouldn't want to bring back a guy who potentially wants to be here. He said that he watched a ton of Giants when he went to college at, Oregon State, grew up, in the Seattle area. So West Coast guy, close to home-ish here in San Francisco, and, watched a lot of the Giants when they were at their best. And I just don't think the team is all that hesitant to give out a significant contract to a position player when they like the player and the player wants to be here. Like, from what we understand, they offered Brandon Nimmo a competitive offer this offseason. He ended up going back to the Mets on a pretty hefty deal, and it was, returning to the team he was coming from. And so that you're often going to lose out when the player has experience at the team and likes playing for that team. So I don't know. I just wouldn't rule out Conforto opting out, but the Giants then re-signing him. And Pederson, kind of same deal. I wouldn't rule out the Giants bringing him back even if he reaches free agency. And Crawford, I think position players might get that treatment. So when we look at the outfield next year, Haniger, it was a 2-year deal with then an opt-out. So we don't have to worry about the opt-out until after 2024. But so Haniger will be back in the outfield in 2024. And Yastrzemski still has, going into 2024, he'll still have 2 more years of team control. Speaking of, players who kind of he didn't come up through their system, but when he made his major league debut, it was with the Giants. And that's why Yaz has been here for a long time. And he'll continue to be here for a couple more years after 2023. And so Yaz comes back. Austin Slater has another year of team control. And Mitch Haniger comes back. And so they've got a lot of outfielders there. So Conforto, I think there's like kind of going to be a Conforto-sized hole in the outfield going into next year if he opts out. And looking at, the list of free agent outfielders, there's Ian Happ, who is intriguing and pretty young, switch hitter. I like him. And Harrison Bader, Cody Bellinger again, and I think the Giants tried to sign him this offseason. And Michael Conforto if he opts out. Teoscar Hernandez. That's kind of it in the outfield. So there are some guys out there, and I would expect the Giants to be in play for at least one outfielder next offseason. Shortstop is that position. Third base, they don't have a clear third baseman. David Villar is going to get that opportunity, but Manny Machado is kind of lurking as the top like pure position player next offseason. There's Shohei Ohtani, but he's a unicorn in that he's a DH and a pitcher. But Machado is like a position player, but he's not young anymore. He's 30. He's going to be 31, and the contract they offered to Correa, he was entering his age 28 season. The contract they offered to Harper, he was entering his age 26 season. Judge was entering age 31, but he had that connection to the Giants, like grew up a Giants fan and all that. And so for Machado, I just don't know how likely that is. And for Ohtani, I keep saying this, it's a pitcher. And they're not willing to give Gausman or Rodon a 4 or a 5 or 6 year deal. Why are they going to give Shohei Ohtani 12 years when he's half a pitcher? I don't know. And I really struggle with this. Like I don't know because he's such a star and such a he would bring so much attention to the Giants, and obviously he's so talented right now. But do you worry about the arm 13 years from now, or even 5 years from now? So I look to Machado as a good fallback option, but after those two guys, it's kind of a free agent class that's devoid of star talent. But those guys are stars. But it's just like, will they actually get one of them? I don't know. And so that's why kind of homegrown talent is going to be also really, really important, because if you don't come away with either of those guys, where are the stars coming from? And it's got to come from within. So anyway, that's kind of my preliminary look at where the Giants are in 2024. Going into next offseason, I think that they're just like they've been the last few years, in a flexible financial position where they can pursue basically anybody they want to. And they also can move on from players who underperform because they don't have like basically any long-term guaranteed commitments. And just keep in mind, the homegrown players, the players are committed to coming back, but the team gets to decide if they want to do that. And also, just lastly, Casey Schmidt could be the answer at shortstop potentially. They're gonna put him there in spring training. He played some there in the minor leagues last year. I don't think like the answer, but he could become an option. And also, perhaps Thairo Estrada is capable of sliding over. And then you're looking at a second baseman. I'm talking about when Brandon Crawford, when he has his contract end. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On MLB Prospects. Host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button if you're on YouTube, or like, comment, share, whatever you could do. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. I think we're going to put out a mailbag prompt, so look out on Twitter for that. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.